Hey everybody, this is going to be a quick video. I mean, the last Dash project was an hour and 15 minutes long, so this won't be that long. To sort of discuss the recent breaking developments with Hobbico. Now, we had talked in our last Stash Report video about the fact that the ESOP investigation, the Employee Stock Ownership Program investigation, was still continuing at Hobbico. This all stemmed from last year, where some long-term employees had quit. We're talking 10-plus year-long employees, not just some guy who came in, worked a warehouse over Christmas or anything. These people were owed large sums of money, large 5-digit sums of money for their time that they put into the stock program, and Hobbico was, they say, unable, unwilling, something or other, unable to pay for those ESOP payments at the mandated time. They had X amount of years, I believe it was 2 or 3, it might have been 5, I'd have to go reread the article for the exact time. That time is not the important part. When that time was up, the separation from the company was done, they have to refund the money, basically, at the current stock price. Now, the stock price is a sort of a made-up number because Hobbico is a private company. The owners are, in effect, all of the employees. And so, you would be paid for whatever the valuation of the company would be. They didn't pay out the ESOP. The employees were less than thrilled about this, so they initiated a complaint to the Department of Labor. The Department of Labor came over and said, no, you can't do that. You need to pay for it. They went, meh, we don't know what you're talking about. And a year-long investigation has ensued. It is now over a year since that investigation started taking place. Typical government, quickness, right? We talked about the fact that this had just been brought up again before Christmas because the company had been reevaluated by Hobbico itself, and the value of the company was now 82% less than it was this time in 2016-2017. Which, of course, meant that these people's investments were now a 4-digit investment instead of a 5-digit investment. And I warned you all that this didn't look good, and that we could be looking at a Hobbico bankruptcy. Poo-poo, no, you don't know what you're talking about, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Because to me, this isn't a hobby thing. This isn't like, oh, well, Revell didn't make enough money, so Hobbico is, having difficulties. It's not that. This is a financial thing, and I have been involved, for better or for worse, with financial things for pretty much my entire life. My father was in banking. My mother was in banking. This is a career I chose not to go into, but something that I'm very well versed in. I can read corporate reports and stuff like that. It's not something I wanted to do with my life per se, as far as what I do professionally, but it doesn't mean that I don't know how to read the lines and the in-between the lines and stuff like that. So I was going to mention, because this was just brought up again in the comment section of a recent video, that on Tuesday, they announced that they were closing their Reno, Nevada warehouse. You might say, West Coast warehouse, what's the big deal? The Reno, Nevada warehouse was closed without warning, basically. They gave everybody like 30-day notice. It's going to close at the end of February. But it was a 200,000 square foot warehouse, which is bigger than a super Walmart for the people who can't figure out square footage. So it wasn't like it was just, the local post office, etc., that they were shipping packages through. This was a major facility and a major operation. Okay, that's a cost-cutting thing right there. When you close down that big a thing, just suddenly you're trying to cut your costs dramatically with something. Well, folks, unfortunately, and I will leave the link to the news article in the description of this video if you have not already seen it on a forum or on Facebook or on our Facebook group itself. This morning, Hobbico declared bankruptcy. They are filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. They have not actually, I don't believe they technically have filed yet, but they declared that they're filing. I want to say up front, I have to put a disclaimer here because I've already been accused of being giddy about this scenario. So people seem to think I hate Revell, and that's not the situation. I don't hate Revell. I don't hate Ed Sexton. I don't hate anybody at Revell. I have nothing ill will against anybody at Revell. I think some of Revell's kits are a little shady in the proportion areas, but the kit engineering part's always been good. They assemble. They don't necessarily look like they're supposed to, but they assemble. So I don't have anything against anybody at Revell. I am not giddy about this. This affects Hobbico as a whole, not just Revell. This is the entire corporation that owns Revell, Revell of Germany. It is Great Plains, the wholesale distributor. It is Tower Hobbies, the retail distributor, because Tower Hobbies and Great Plains are what merged to be Hobbico in the first place. Estes Rockets, a whole bunch of RC stuff, a whole bunch of just random odds and ends about the hobby. There's a list of like 30 some odd companies they own. I'm not going to read it to you. They were the exclusive North and South American distributors for Italeri. They were the North American distributors for Hasegawa. They employ 300 plus people. So up front, before I go into the nitty gritty here, I just want to say that I feel awful for their employees. Their employees didn't do this. Their employees, in good faith, invested their money into this employee stock ownership program. And I mean all of the employees, not just the two people that got this whole ball rolling. And with the bankruptcy, more than likely, not only are they going to lose their jobs, because the Chapter 11 is a liquidation. Right now, what we're looking at with Hobbico's situation is that if somebody doesn't grant them financing to reorganize in Chapter 11, or grant them financing to continue operating in the next 2 months, in April they will be liquidated. That'll be it. Hobbico will be sold off, probably in pieces, but Hobbico will cease to exist, and so will 324 people's jobs. That sucks. Second of all, it isn't Revell's fault. Revell didn't have anything to do with this directly. Now, you could sit there and you could look at Hobbico, or not Hobbico, but when, I can't remember what the actual ownership group was called, but from the late 1990s, right around the time that Racing Champions bought out AMT Ertl, or AMT and NPC from Ertl, because Ertl kept their stuff. That's why you don't have any AMT reissues of John Deere farm tractors. All that was Ertl tooling, and they kept it. When they bought out AMT Ertl, mostly for the NASCAR stuff and the die-cast collectible end of that business, Revell was also sold to a private equity group. That private equity group was owned by a gentleman who would later go on to buy Lindbergh from Testers, who, with Kraft House owned Lindbergh, and immediately created Lindbergh, of course, into the ground and bankrupted it, which is when it was sold to Round 2 back in 2012. That, you could argue who was not financed there. Did Revell not sell enough? The hobby was a icky thing right then anyway. And then Binney and Smith bought them out, which is the parent company of Crayola. Crayola obviously never went bankrupt when they owned Revell. They didn't necessarily exploit Revell to its full extent, at least in my humble opinion. But they never, they weren't hemorrhaging cash with Revell. But in 2008, they sold Revell to Hobbico, which everyone lauded as being this great thing, because now a distribution company, a giant distribution company that was heavily involved in the hobby from the 1970s and 80s, now owned this Revell monogram. Woohoo! Well, it's not. They've since then bought Revell of Germany, Estes, and all these other companies. So it's not like Revell at its core is what's responsible for this bankruptcy filing. That ESOP that everybody owns, from the people in Champaign that work in the warehouse, to the people at Revell, to the people at Estes, all these separate companies that still operate as subsidiaries rather than being just the kits that you get from Revell don't say Hobbico on them. They say Hobbico on the copywriting and stuff like that, but, they're not, it's not a Hobbico Ford Ranger, it's a Revell Ford Ranger. Those people's ESOPs are now valueless, because in a bankruptcy proceeding, what will happen is the creditors, if they choose to float financing, will want those shares in exchange, so they have control of the company, so that the company doesn't do more stupid crap. So they're not only these people possibly more than likely going to lose their jobs, but they've also lost all of the money they've invested in their business, basically. So up front, before anyone says anything, I feel awful for the people. I don't want to make this sound like I'm cheerleading the destruction of Hobbico, because it's not this isn't what that's about. This is the realities of the situation. If you can't handle the realities of the situation, then just turn this video off and go about your blasé, boring life that you don't want to know. Because this isn't going to be that type of thing where I'm going to sugarcoat what's going to happen here. Okay, so if nobody finances Hobbico, in April they get sold off. More than likely, because the debt ratio, as you'll read if you read the article, is a 10-to-1 debt ratio. Basically, they have... These things are categorized in groups, right? They're brackets. They're not exact numbers. Their assets are $10 to $50 million. Their debt is $100 to $500 million. It's basically, their debt is 10 times higher than their assets. or the company is worth 1/10 of what it is because of all of this money they owe. How do they get into this problem? Well, a lot of companies get into this problem. You see this all the time with pretty much every bankruptcy filing you'll ever come across. Companies do not grow organically. Hobbico didn't make model kits and then buy Revell, right? Hobbico distributed hobby stuff, and somewhere along the lines, 20 years after they merged the two companies into one, they decided, hey, Benny and Smith wants to get rid of Revell. That's a good price. We're going to buy it. Well, they bought a lot of stuff. Again, the company, the company list is 35, 40 names long worth of companies they own, and they never bought, and none of this stuff is stuff that Hobbico created. It's all stuff that they have purchased in the last 25 years. Is that stuff as profitable as they thought it was going to be? Or is it just not turning the profit? Or is it, I said maybe some of the stuff didn't fit with what they wanted to do, and other people pointed out that, well, all of the companies are involved in the hobbies, and that is true. All of the companies are hobby related, but, that doesn't necessarily mean they integrate well within what Hobbico is, or what they do. Now, if that is Revell, it's possible, being that a lot of the other stuff is RC stuff. But Revell also, at this time, wasn't losing money. Wasn't making a great ton of it, but wasn't losing anything either. So the chances are Revell will be spun off into something else. Revell of Germany, remember Hobbico bought Revell of Germany in 2012. What's going to happen to them? Because that's a whole other country, literally. Tower Hobbies. I mean, a lot of us buy our models from Tower Hobbies that don't have local hobby shops, or don't have a Hobby Lobby to go to, or don't go to Hobby Lobby for religious reasons or whatever. Great Plains is the wholesale distributor. A lot of places like Hobbytown USA, well, not Hobbytown USA has their own distribution network, but they're getting them from Great Plains to begin with. But Hobbytown USA, your local hobby shop, Michael's, Hobby Lobby, all these places that are buying their kits through Great Plains via Hobbico, well, now how does everybody get their stuff? So Great Plains and Tower Hobbies, perhaps as a package deal, would make the most sense to me anyway, will get spun off into its own thing. Or maybe that'll be all that's left of Hobbico, is that part there. And all these other little things like Estes and all these RC companies probably get packaged together. But all these toy things and all these little itty-bitty companies here and there that they picked up for little random niche stuff, more likely they'll get just swallowed up by whatever their competitors are along the way. The thing about swallowing up the two model companies, which is what we care about, is Revell of Germany. I think the best thing, personally speaking here, best thing Revell of Germany could happen to them would be the ownership group that owned them prior to 2012 in Germany comes back and saves them. Revell has bought and sold Revell of Germany at least twice in its history. It has been Revell in name only because that name was, symbolized something. It was a name that they kept because changing it from Revell to Germany Model Company nobody would know what that is, and nobody would have bought anything because it's a new company and things like that. So Revell of Germany has been separate from the Revell of the United States back in the day before Hobbico and all the sales and everything started, and it's also been separated since it's been Revell Monogram a second time. So hopefully that 2012 ownership group can come back in. I don't know what kind of agreements were signed. Obviously, I have no insider knowledge. This is all just educated guesses. Because that group that owned it prior to 2012, that's who made the DTM kits, that's who made the Beetles, the Golfs, even though they came out after the company was sold. That stuff was in development prior to the company being sold, so the company, Hobbico just went, oh yeah, all this stuff is already in process, we'll just go ahead and run it. You've noticed the decrease in the actual Revell of Germany since Hobbico has owned it. It's the stuff that we've gotten here recently, especially like the Panamera and its weirdness. They also were the ones that had the Ferrari licensing that Hobbico can't afford or couldn't. Well, they can't afford it because they couldn't afford to pay their own employees, right? But they couldn't afford to keep the Ferrari licensing. Get that ownership group back in there. Get Revell of Germany back where it was and restart that Ferrari licensing, because at this point, Revell of Germany is going to sell for next to nothing because it's part of this U.S.-owned company at this point, and they can go ahead and back in, buy it, and still keep their money because they're going to be able to buy it for way less than they ever sold it for. Then we have the Revell of the United States. This is a difficult situation here because we've done the Revell being owned by a private equity company before, and it doesn't work. Or it didn't work. It could work, but it didn't. Who has hobby knowledge, manufacturing experience, and a boatload of money. It's not Mobius. I mean, they've got a couple of those things, but not a boatload of money. Tom Lowe, the guy that owns Round 2. He is, as we talked about before, the heir of the litter box fortune. His father invented Tidy Cat litter, literally what his dad did. So he has a lot of money. Plus, he owned Playing Mantis and sold that for a whole boatload of money. That's how he bought Round 2, or bought, back into Round 2 the second time. Get it to Round 2, it's the second go around. And he was a financial guy. He has cash. Besides his inheritance, he made his own money. Does he want Revell and Monogram? Do we? Yeah, the question: do we want Round 2 to own everything? I really don't care. I mean, I don't think it would be a bad thing necessarily. It might overextend, Round 2's capabilities up front. But if you bring on, the people at Revell to a certain extent, some people probably could stand to be replaced, but a lot of the core people probably need to stay, at least in the short term, and have Revell become a subsidiary of Round 2 the way Lindbergh is and the way MPC is. I guarantee you that Round 2 will use the Monogram corporate branding a lot more than Revell ever or Hobbico ever did, and they'll probably use it correctly, where they're not going to take old Revell kits and put them in Monogram boxes and take old Monogram kits and put them in Revell boxes like they did back 2-3 years ago. So this is going to be a very interesting 2018. It's going to be a very interesting time in the next 3 to 6 months to see exactly what is going to happen with Revell. John went on to Stevens International and looked at what the expected kits are for the second quarter. I believe there are 5, and they are nothing that is going to even crack it. Well, that's not true. There's a Tom Daniels thing in there, which will get somebody's interest up. But, I mean, we'll talk more about it when it becomes more clear exactly what they're going to do with the second quarter, because if it's just 5 kits, then we're really showing the people at Revell knew what was going to happen before, Hobbico declared this today. They figure they can just maybe, squeeze this stuff out with the finances that they have available. But it's all reissues. There's not even a modified retooling in there. And so, I refuse to believe that Revell implodes and that's it. There's too much value within the name of Revell. Somebody somewhere will make a go at it. Now, how good a decision that's going to be, depending on what their background is, I don't know. I've seen on a forum that everybody should pool their money together and buy Revell. And somebody else pointed out, well, that would be like 100 different people saying 100 different things. And they're like, oh, yeah, 100 new tool kits to start off. That sounds great. I've told you this before. There's a lot of people online who, if given control of a model company, would bankrupt it in 6 months. And this would probably bankrupt it in 90 days. Just because you build model kits doesn't mean you have any business acumen whatsoever or have any kind of detachment from your own personal preferences. I'd love to see this kit, that kit, these decals, that paint. I could give you a laundry list of things I'd like. But of that laundry list of things I'd like, not very much of it is stuff that would sell, enough to justify a $300,000 investment in a new piece of tooling steel. So there's, a lot of people complain about companies being conservative. Well, when your parent company is going bankrupt, you don't have a lot of choice in the matter. So, again, feel terrible for the employees. It's not their fault. Feel bad for Revell, because for once Revell's failing, whatever you want to call it. It's not their fault either. So, stay tuned. It's going to be, I said at the end of last year to friends, not on video, that it's going to be a very, very interesting year, because 2017, towards the middle part of 2017, it was a very weird time within the hobby if you knew what you were looking at. Based on what was coming out of companies, what wasn't coming out of companies, people who left, people who stayed, and the directions things were looking at. And now 2018 is already living up to its billing, and we're 10 days into the year. I mean, I suppose best case scenario, worst case scenario, in the same thing, because it does nothing to solve any of the problems, or the underlying problems anyway, would be that somebody finances this mess, takes control of it in terms of the ownership and who's in management, and it just floats on as a zombie company until hopefully somebody can get up in front of it and control it and make something out of it. Best case scenario, because most people will keep their jobs, they'll lose the ESOPs, but the supply chain doesn't have a massive disruption in it, because how does Revell distribute their kits if they go bankrupt? Because there's no way to do that. They don't have a network set up to distribute their own stuff. That was all through Great Plains and Tower Hobbies via Hobbico. Best case scenario is that Tom Lowe buys out Revell, or there's some other intrinsically hobby-loving multi-millionaire out there, or guy who can raise venture capital, or whatever you want to say, that can buy the company and steer it correctly for the next 5 to 10 years until things really can be evened out, and see where Revell really is in real life, as a separate entity and a separate corporation. Because anybody who buys Revell has to have a boatload of cash behind them, because they're going to have to reestablish a distribution network. They're going to have to reestablish everything, because everything was done through a parent company. They have not been their own entity in 10 years. And before that, they weren't their own entity, because that was when Biddy and Smith owned them. And before that, they weren't their entity. They haven't been their own entity since 1998.
So I forgot to dance again.
And, we'll have to see exactly where that all winds up leading, because I'm intrigued. I don't think Revell dies. I don't think Revell goes away. I know the hobby is going to die. The angels are circulating these topics, and they're just waiting to pile in there. I already see it on Facebook that if they weren't charging so much for their models, and if this wasn't happening, that wasn't happening. It's like, yeah, okay. Somebody said that they're charging the same amount. This plastic is the same as it was 50 years ago. Yeah, of course, because the plastic, and not to say nothing of the tooling cost, the employee cost, the design cost, all this computerization that happened in the last 50 years. And just a 2,000-pound box of plastic pellets. That cost exactly the same amount as it did 50 years ago. And so does cardboard and ink and paper and plastic wrap and and decals. It all costs the same amount as it did 50 years ago. You can argue that it costs too much. There's maybe an inch of truth in that. Not if you really know it, but maybe you can argue that there is. But to say that it's the same thing as it was 50 years ago, those are the people that want to own Revell. Those are the people that want to create an ownership group of hobbyists and own the company. And I can't think of anything I want less than people who think they know what they're doing in charge of this, because people who thought they knew what they were doing are in charge of it, and have probably created it into the ground again. So, again, guys, we'll keep you up to date. Sorry for the bad news if you haven't heard already, but that's where we're at with it. So, anyway, guys, back on Friday. See you guys on the other side.